Welcome to Old Path Ministries and our study through the book of 2 Samuel. We reached chapter 8, and chapters 8, 9, and 10 is what we'll cover today. May not be the full hour, but what we're looking at is really kind of just historical of what happened once David really kind of came into that place, walking in his promises that God had made to him, kind of really when God had established his kingdom. Set it in order in chapter 7, as you see. And what he's going to do is kind of, I guess you could look at it and say it's pretty much what God had intended to take place when the children of Israel first came into the land. And David probably went further in subduing the nations, though not totally driving them out, than really they had at any particular time. So with all of that said, where we get to in the text, by the time we get to chapter 11, it's really the first horrible kind of sinful thing that David really falls into. And we're all very familiar with it, the whole Bathsheba thing. So we'll look at that when we get there. A couple of things before we look at the text. There are a number of locations that are mentioned here, kings. Some of it we know the exact locations. Some of it are kind of hidden to us. The major players that we know, when we hear Ammon, when we hear Moab, when we hear Philistines, we know pretty much where those places are. So what we'll be able to look at, I'm putting up a map now that will help in showing just kind of the general areas where David went, because it's pretty much the battles that are mentioned here is, it's pretty much top to bottom, kind of north to south, and everything that is kind of even east to west. So there is quite a bit of military campaign that goes on here, and a lot of the history as to why things happen as they did is really lost to us. You're going to find the parallel chapters in First Chronicles about this, and there's some overlap in those things and some other details that are given, some that are omitted. They're just not included in Chronicles, but you can look at the two and put them together, get somewhat of a composite. You do find that there are times when names are recorded differently, but we know that there are a number of people who have been called by different names for the same person. Simon Peter, obviously, there was a change in the way that we use his name, and that was more because of the things that Jesus had said. Also, when we think of Saul of Tarsus, Saul or Paul, depending on whether you're using his kind of the Gentile name for him or the Jewish name for him. So the idea that people could have different names is really of no consequence, rather, because there's no change really in the events themselves. So what we're looking at here, it's just clearly historic. It meant so much more to the people of the nation at the time, and this is really kind of a chronicling of the things that took place from the writer of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Samuel's long since gone, so it's clearly not him recording these things, but what we have is a history that is somewhat contemporary, seemingly, to David's lifetime, but Chronicles written much later on. So written kind of looking back as a historical writing. So anyway, with all of that said, the map that I'll put up will pretty much go over a lot of the areas that we're already familiar with, but it'll have some of the place names that are helpful too. So screenshot it, do whatever you need to do to keep a copy of it. Because again, what we're going to look at here is clearly just historical. It's kind of some housekeeping things that the writer of 2 Samuel wants to record some of the military campaigns that took place. In between chapter 9 is David remembering his kind of like his brother in the closest that they had of he and Jonathan, and looking to the house of Saul and of Jonathan to see if there were any of the descendants. And we see that David has still a very warm place in his heart for the family of Saul, particularly of Jonathan. So with all of that said, let's get to chapter 8 and let's have a word of prayer. Father, as we come to you, we pray, God, that you would bless the time in your word today. And we ask, Lord, that you would help us to be attentive to what we see here. And though it is a lot of history, there is also things that we can take from it and making the proper application. So we pray, Lord, that you would bless this time of study, and as we prepare to get to really kind of the next portion of this book, we realize the importance of not only the history, because it's their history, and the idea of keeping it all straight for them, but much more important to them as they would think of it as their nation in the land. But we can look back on it. We thank you that you have recorded these things. There's nothing that you have recorded that is not important. And so may we have that respect for your word, and we ask that by your Spirit you would open our eyes. We give you thanks and we give you all praise in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. David, I think we can all kind of agree on this, and we can see it really, though God didn't want them to be governed by a king, and he made that abundantly clear when it was Saul, yet at the same time we do recognize that it was what the people had chosen for themselves, and even in the midst of that, God would honor what was this position of the king if the king would have honor and respect for what God would have wanted him to do. A man who would be faithful to the law. We see that David was very, very tender-hearted towards those things, had what could only be described as a very dynamic walk with God, and wholly, completely trusted him, was dedicated to the Lord, was very, very careful to do what he knew was right according to the law. And so, of course, we see that the country prospers under him. In fact, because of all of what David does and the things that we'll read about here, they amassed what could only be considered kind of a fortune. And it helped in really ultimately paying for the temple that would come through Solomon, and all of kind of the reforms that would, not reforms, but all of the, even some expansion that would take place even up to Solomon's time, which we'll look at. It's actually in the map that you see there. And so with all of that said, what we were able to do is take a look at David and say, the difference between the kingdom under Saul as opposed to the kingdom under David are two entirely different things. So Saul found himself in a place of just warfare at all times, never seemingly able to come to victory. Clearly we see that he was a man who was deeply troubled mentally, spiritually. This was just a guy who never ever could take hold of what God would have put in his hands. David is a different kind of person altogether. And so what we're going to see is that by the time that we look at these three chapters, you can pretty much say that David was kind of without dispute the sovereign in that whole part of the world. And though it's not a huge nation, you just see that God delivered them into his hands as he had promised to do all the way back with Joshua. So that's what's important for us to remember. David would be recognizing in even his military campaigns that the success that came from them was completely because God had given them success. But boy, when you think about this, I was reading through it and thinking of all the far-reaching areas where David would have left military soldiers and left elements of his military scattered into some pretty distant places, relatively speaking, especially the way that people had to travel. And very, very impressive that he was able to do that, and it was making sure that tribute was brought. And it put David in an incredibly powerful position, and yet, interestingly enough, this was not a man who seemingly abused his power. So, fascinating guy. All right, 2 Samuel chapter 8. It says, "Now, after this, it came to pass that David attacked the Philistines and subdued them. And David took Metheg Ammah from the hand of the Philistines." It's just another way of saying Gath. So it's just more of a description of the area around Gath. So he attacks first to the west. That's the first of the conquests. Remember, once again, this is on the heels of chapter 7, where God had told David, I'm going to make a house of you, and a way of saying a house is a family line that will come from you, that will have a king who will ultimately reign forever. And so David, the end of chapter 7, it was one of those, God, if that's what you've said, then let it be so. And that's how it ends. Now that's why it says to us in chapter 8, now after these things, or after this came to pass. So he begins to subdue the land, and the boundaries are pretty impressive when you stop to think about them, even when you compare them to something like, say, Genesis 15, because It goes well in excess of their northern border, certainly all the way of their southern border, and it moves very much towards the east. And if not for the fact that there's the Mediterranean there, he may have gone further west than even that, but he's going to subdue the Philistines, as we see. That starts, his campaign starting to the west is beginning to take shape. It says now, he defeated Moab, and forcing them down to the ground, he measured them off with a line. With 2 lines he measured off those to be put to death. With 1 full line he kept alive, and so the Moabites became David's servants and brought tribute to Israel. Now, this again, kind of troubling. Moab, if you remember when David was having all of his problems with Saul, he took his family to Moab and watch over my family, my mother, my father, and see to their well-being. Now, we don't get this anywhere in the scripture. This comes more from Jewish historians, that something happened to his family at the hand of the Moabites. Now, whether this is all true, again, it's just speculation, but he sure has a problem with the Moabites for some reason. But at one time, when Saul was the problem and David was afraid that Saul was going to kill his family, he left them to the safekeeping of Moab. So something radical changes between them. We don't get any details. It just says now he took these, what would seem as forcing them to the ground, gives the impression that that he had taken as prisoner. Now, depending on how you read it, some would translate it that he broke them into thirds, some that it was just in half, and it just depends on how you read it and how you would translate the Hebrew. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in it, because whether it's 2/3 or whether it's half, he takes even of the prisoners and he puts them to death. Now, some people would look at that and they would say, well, that seems so cruel. It seems so, it just seems so over the top. Why would you do such a thing? If it's personal, and if the history of the non-biblical history of it is true, this could very well be him repaying them for what they did to his family and maybe others that were with them. It can also be that idea that if you are able to decimate a people, it's more difficult for them to make war against you. So you deplete their ranks tremendously by at least half, maybe 2/3, and it makes that nation much less formidable if they're going to come against you. So however it may be, he wipes out just an enormous number of them. David also defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, the king of Zobah, so to the north. And again, if you didn't take a picture of that map, you can pause right here, go back in the video, take a screenshot of it so you're able to reference it, because there's a lot going on here. And he went on then to recover his territory at the river Euphrates. Now, this would be the area of the river Euphrates, since it's mentioned here, that would be not only to the north, but it would be somewhat in the east, to the northeast, because the river Euphrates really starts at where basically the Mediterranean dead ends and ends up around Turkey. So this area here, that's where the Euphrates comes, and then it starts to work its way down. So this area of Zobah is inland and to the north, but that just gives you an idea how far up into the north he had gone. So he took from him 1,000 chariots, 700 horsemen, and 20,000 foot soldiers. Also David hamstrung all the chariot horses, except that he spared enough of them for 100 chariots. Now that doesn't say that he didn't destroy the chariots. It just simply says that what he left was enough of the functioning horses to do what would help in the military sense, or to bring things back and forth, if it's nothing more than just information back and forth from the north. But he wipes out the force that is arrayed against him, and he breaks their ability to make war again, at least initially, because the chariots are all gone. And he wipes out a big number of the armed people, the military force there in the north. So far we have seen that he has taken out the Philistines to the west, and now he's moved up to the north. And then in verse 5, now when the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, the king of Zobah, David killed 22,000 of the Syrians, And David put garrisons in Syria of Damascus, and the Syrians became David's servants and brought tribute. So the Lord preserved David wherever he went. Important part, that interjection that it was God who was preserving him. So David may very well have had a real good prowess for military things and maybe been great tactician. You could be all of those things, but at the end of the day, it's God who's making sure that he is successful. And remember, God had said all the way back in Joshua and to Joshua, do as I'm commanding you to do, be faithful to me and all that I require of you, and I'm going to give you success. We saw that in Joshua's time for the most part. There were still those places, the Jebusites, that were doing what they were doing and keeping what is Jerusalem. David finally took it back from them. We know that there were some people that managed to escape what really God had asked to do, and that was to purge the land of the people who would be an irritant to Israel, not only in the sense of what David's having to clean up here militarily, but also in their paganism that would make its way into the nation and corrupt them. So this was God's reason for wanting them gone, and really it's starting to happen more so in David's time than at really any time in their history. And we're reading about it right here. Again, it's part of the reason why I think that God had them be careful to record these things. So it tells us in verse 7, so David took the shields of gold that belonged to the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. Also, Beta from Berothai, called Hadadezer the king David took, and a large amount of bronze. Then, and when Toi, the king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated all the army of Hadadezer, that was Toi, then sent Joram, his son, to King David to greet him and to bless him because he had fought against Hadadezer and defeated him, for Hadadezer had been at war with Toi, and Joram brought with him articles of silver, articles of gold, and articles of bronze. So what you have here now is another group that doesn't need to be engaged. In fact, this man here is Toi, has been fighting against the same people that David has now fought against, but David has captured them and defeated them, rather. And so this man says, don't want any problems with you. I'm thankful that you've done what you've done. And he brings him tribute, sends his own son. David is such a different person when it comes to this. Because you'll see when David sends people to other nations, the way that the nations deal with him, they think that he has ulterior motives. And David doesn't seem to have those same limitations. So notice what David does with it. So King David also dedicated these to the Lord, along with the silver and the gold that he had dedicated from all of the nations which he had subdued. So this is David not amassing this wealth to himself, but saying this is given back to the service of the Lord, to do with it what he wills. So David doesn't look to enrich himself. He's the king of a very, very powerful nation by this time. He doesn't need to take personal gain in this. Well, verse 12, from Syria and from Moab, from the people of Ammon, and from the Philistines, from Amalek, and from the spoil of Hadadezer, the son of Rohab, the king of Zobah. And David then made himself a name when he returned from the killing of 18,000 Syrians in the Valley of Salt. And so, again, to the north. So he also put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all of Edom, he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants, and the Lord preserved David wherever he went. Second time that we've heard that said. Now, when you start to think of Moab and Edom, my goodness, you're really starting to figure Dead Sea, Moab, Edom, and going down even from there, the Ammonites would be over in this area, which is modern-day Jordan. So notice the expansion of what Israel is it's made its way on the other side of the Jordan River. Even as it exits from the Dead Sea, he's taking territory that is even to the east of that when you start again, Moab down into Edom. So these nations realize they couldn't fight against David, so they become basically vassals. They become people that pay tribute, and they keep peace with David because they see him as impossible to defeat. So what you find here, again, in the summary, verses 15 to 18, is David is established. And that's the important part of this. David is now established as the sovereign not only in Israel, but really he's the guy that is seen as the biggest of the big players on the block in that whole part of the Middle East, from not only the nation of Israel as we would even know it today, but the surrounding nations, the surrounding kingdoms. They were also in a place of sending tribute to him. Nobody was challenging him. So what David does from that point, he reigned over all of Israel, and he administered judgment and justice to all the people. So adjudicating things of people's needs and then making sure that justice was served as it would come to be needed. So here are the people that he put in place. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, he was over the army. Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was the recorder. He's the scribe, the person who's writing down the details. And then then Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, were the priests, now in different locations, basically. Sariah was then the scribe, another person who is keeping record. Now, the scribe would be the one who's dealing more with the religious matters, and the recorder that is next to David would be the person who's recording the things that the king would say and making sure that they're implemented. So, verse 18, Benaniah, the son of Jehoiada, was over both of the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were chief ministers. Now, that is anything from seeing to the day-to-day of things. They were his advisors. We find out that among them, unfortunately, as we're going to see, is Absalom. A lot of very interesting things are going to be taking place in the not-too-distant future from what we're reading here. So, chapter 8 just says, God makes him this promise. Chapter 7, David says, according to your word, let it be so. He sees that God is going to make a great king and a great kingdom out of his family that will have an enduring legacy even into the eternal or the forever. The important part of that is that David embraces it and says, let it be so. So then chapter 8 continues right on that and says, so David goes to battle with these surrounding nations and he subdues them and does so in a very, very convincing fashion, so that really he doesn't have much in the way of rivals. So what to do next? David being David, chapter 9 tells us that. So then David said, is there still anyone who is left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now, it's not just that it's only that he wouldn't have done it for Saul's people, but Jonathan is really in thought here. If we remember from David's whole life when Saul was alive, Saul wanted David dead. David didn't want Saul dead. He had more than one opportunity to do it. And frankly, if he wanted to go to war and try to do it, he probably had many other opportunities from that. But David viewed Saul as, hey, as long as he's alive, that's the man that God has anointed. Though by that time David himself had been anointed by Samuel and told that he was going to be king. And yet David recognized that that would be a future thing, but for the here and now, Saul was still in place, and God had him alive. David was not going to take matters into his own hand. Just a fascinating, fascinating guy. Well, there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. So when they had called him to David, the king said to him, are you Ziba? And he said, at your service. And the king said to him, is there not still someone of the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness, the kindness of God? And you can't help but notice that David has to recognize that everything that I have is here because of the Lord. And so why would I not return the kindness that God has shown me to the family, the heritage of Saul, the first king? So David has great motives here. So in verse 4, so the king said to him, where is he? Verse 3. The king said, is there not someone of the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness of God? And Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan who is lame in his feet. Oh, okay, great. So look at how he basically says this. Is there somebody of Saul's line? Because I want to take care of Saul's line for the sake of Jonathan. And then he hears Jonathan had a son, and he's lame in his feet. He has, there's a problem with he's not able to walk as we would think, and so Mephibosheth is this guy's name. So, verse 4, David asks, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "Indeed, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lo-debar." And so King David sent and brought him out of the house of Machir, the son of Amiel. See, now these names are easy if you're familiar with Hebrew. That not for us. So, verse 6, now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face and prostrated himself to David, and he said, and David said, "Mephibosheth," and he answered, "Here is your servant." Now, from Mephibosheth, he may have heard David wants to show you kindness, but you can tell by his reaction here, this is probably one of those, is everything okay? Because he's on his face before him. Well, it doesn't take long. David said to him, "Do not fear." So clearly there was a fearfulness here. No matter what the reports were, there's a fearfulness. He says, "I'm going to show you, I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake." You're his son. Now think about it again. When we know about David and Jonathan, they were the best of friends, to the point of even closer than brothers, as it says. They were of one soul. So just very, very close. And so this is basically, if you're thinking of David, he would be able to say it to Mephibosheth, if that was any kind of a discussion that we don't have record of. There was none like your father. He and I, there was no one closer to me than your father. And so, basically you're his son. It's kind of like what's his is mine kind of a thing. I'll treat you like a son, which he does. Of course, there are going to be some intrigues with this down the road, but we'll leave this here for the time being. So David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you will eat bread at my table continually." So I'm going to give you everything that belonged to your father. So you're going to have all of your holdings in Benjamin, okay, because remember, Saul was a Benjamite, so a little bit to the north and somewhat to the west. He's going to get all of those things, and they're going to be given to him. But as for you, Mephibosheth, you're going to stay here with me. You're going to you're going to eat with me at my table. So then he bowed himself and said, "What is your servant that you should look upon such as a dead dog as I?" And the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given to your master's son all that belonged to Saul and to his house. Again, remember who Ziba is, and this is the guy that's going to be given charge and saying, what I'm about to give to you, it belongs to Mephibosheth. Now you go take care of it. I'm restoring it to him. You see to it, and you see to its well-being, and here's what's supposed to happen. And this is right after Mephibosheth says, who am I that you're doing this? You're the son of Jonathan, that's why. So he says, you therefore, and your sons and your servants, you will work the land for him, and you will bring in the harvest, that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall eat bread at my table always. And now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king has commanded his servant, so will your servant do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, and he ate continually at the king's table, and he was lame in both of his feet. Interesting. So basically, this is David saying, I'm going to treat Mephibosheth as though he's one of my sons because he was Jonathan's son. So think about this. Here's a guy who was just being taken care of. We see that he's got a disability, that he's lame in his feet, means, obviously he wouldn't be able to get around like we would think. But what David does for him is to say, I'm restoring all the land that belonged to your father, so to the household from which you come, everything that was theirs is being given back to them, and Ziba is going to be the person who oversees it. Whatever it produces, it's going to be brought in, and it will belong to Mephibosheth. But as far as Mephibosheth is concerned, he's not going to need anything. I'm going to take care of all of his needs. Just such a cool thing. It helps you to understand a little bit about the nature of David and how he does what he does. So we get to chapter 10, and that says, "And it happened after this that the king of the people of Ammon died, and Hanun the son reigned in his place. And then David said, I will show kindness to Hanun the son of Nahash, as his father showed his kindness to me." Now, before we go on any further, this is another one of those places where we have to say, as far as Ammon is concerned, what was done with Ammon that would make David say, the kindness that they've showed me, I want to now repay it. So this is a father who dies, and everything is left to the son. David sends people to say, what can I do for you? Again, this is a nation who pretty much realizes who David is, and yet we don't know for sure why it is that David looked to the Ammonites and thought, I owe them a debt. In the history, the non-biblical history of Israel, there is more to that whole thing with Moab and the idea that maybe David's parents and those who were left there for safekeeping, that the Moabites had killed them, and that the Ammonites had been involved in helping David in, doing the things that he is doing. So it's not recorded for us in the Bible. So we don't have what I would consider as a source that I would really want to hang my hat on. But it's an interesting thing that you have the Ammonites are north of the Moabites, but they're both on the other side of the Jordan River. They're east of the Jordan. David wants to reach out to this young man who's just now taken over, or this man who has taken over for his father. David has all of the right motivations. Once again, as is so often the case, new administration takes over and the advisors are wrong, and it has just incredibly horrible consequence. They basically say, well, you'll see here. Well, in verse 2, second part of this, David sent by the hand of his servants to comfort him concerning his father. And David's servants came into the land of the people of Ammon. And the princes of the people of Ammon said to Hanun, their lord, do you think that David really honors your father because he sent you comforters? Has David not rather sent his servants to you to search out the city and to spy it out and then to overthrow it? So again, the advisors don't take the time to hear what they've got to say. Just take it into their own hands to go to the king and said, David's sending people here. I think he's got ulterior motives. And that was it. It wasn't discussed any further. And then we see in verse 4, then Hanun took David's servants, shaved off their beards, cut off their garments to the middle at their buttocks, and sent them away. Well, this is the ultimate in humiliation. The cutting off of a man's beard, that was never supposed to be the case. And so this would be just an embarrassment to them, and it would be a reproach. So they realized it. They don't want to go back to Jerusalem looking like this. David hears about it, as we'll see here, and you'll see what happens next. David wants to preserve these men's, integrity. And so in verse 5, and when they told David, he sent to meet them, because the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, wait at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then return. That's until your shame can be taken away from you. Because the shame of having your clothes torn and exposing you and all the rest of that can be fixed in a moment. But the idea of shaving off all of your facial hair, you go back that way and having left in a different way. Again, the shame of it is that we went to do this and these people did this to us. Didn't want that to be the case. And so stay there in Jericho until it grows back. So when the people of Ammon saw that they had made themselves repulsive to David, the people of Ammon sent and they hired the Syrians of Beth Rahab and the Syrians of Zobah, 20,000 foot soldiers, and from the king of Makkah, 1,000 men, and from Ishtob, 12,000 men. And now David heard of it. He sent Joab and all the army of the mighty men. And then the people of Ammon came out and they put themselves in battle array at the entrance of the gate. And the Syrians of Zobah, Beth Rahab, Ishtob, and Makkah were by themselves in the field. Now remember, these are some of the same names that we saw in the 8th chapter. These are some of the people that David had already subdued, and this is what's left of them. So in the first part of it, he's wiped out pretty much their ability to make war, and this is what was left, and now they're coming again in an alliance. Now, that just tells you that the reason that they brought tribute wasn't because they honored David or they liked him, they just feared him. Now, the remnants of all of those defeated ones to somewhat to the south, what you have in the Moabites, and then all the northern parts of that campaign are now gathering with Ammon, which is further inland east from your perspective, kind of on a parallel with Jerusalem, if you will. So here they're going to put themselves all together. David just says, it's all hands on deck. I'm sending out Joab with all of the mighty men. This is going to be it's a battle kind of for the ages. It also will so weaken the ones that were already beat down before in chapter 8, and it's really kind of going to decimate them. And I think it's part of what you'll find, speculation, but you can kind of get the impression, it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination. David becomes a little bit complacent, I think, and not paying as much attention as he should, because it's really peaceful to him, and he'll do what he will do in the next chapter. We'll get there next week. So when the people of Ammon saw that they had made themselves repulsive, they gathered all of these groups together. So David heard of it, sent Joab and all the army of the mighty men. And the people of Ammon came out, and they put themselves in battle array at the entrance of the gate. And the Syrians of Zobah, Beth Rahab, Ishtob, and Maacah were by themselves in the field. And so Joab saw that the battle line was against him before and behind, and so he chose some of Israel's best and put them in battle array against the Syrians. So these coalitions of people put themselves in preparation for war. Joab looks at it. He's the leader of the armies and says, we've got to attack this the right way. You'll see what he decides to do. So the rest of the people he put under the command of Abishai, his brother, that he might set them in battle array against the people of Ammon. So more than likely you're looking at Syria would be to the north, Ammon would be to the east, and so this is how they're kind of setting themselves up. So Israel divides into two parts, one to take care of the attack coming from the north, the other one from the east. And so it says, now when Joab, I'm sorry, in verse 11, so he said to Abishai, Joab says to Abishai, if the Syrians are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the people of Ammon are too strong for you, then I will come and I will help you. So be of good courage. Let us be strong for our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what is good in his sight. Great words that Joab speaks. Now, remember, David has had a little bit of a problem with Joab in that they did some really, really horrible things that should not have been. When David wanted to again show kindness to another king, actually the person that had killed Joab's brother, he concocted a way that he could kill him, and David just said when it all happened, it was not what David wanted, and he said, these men are too severe for me. And so yet that same man, Joab, says here, basically his way of saying, if God wills, then whatever's good for him, this is what we'll do. So, in verse 13, so Joab and the people who were with him drew near for the battle against the Syrians, and they fled before them. So as soon as they get engaged in battle, the Syrians run. When the people of Ammon saw that the Syrians were fleeing, they also fled before Abishai. They entered the city, and so Joab returned from the people of Ammon and went to Jerusalem. Now, when the Syrians saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they gathered together. Then Hadadezer sent, and he brought out the Syrians who were beyond the river, and they came to Helam, and Shobach, the commander of Hadadezer's army, went before them. And it was told David, and he gathered all Israel, crossed over the Jordan, and came to Halem. And the Syrians set themselves in battle array against him, and David fought with him. So now David's also involved in this. The Syrians fled, therefore, before Israel, and David killed 700 charioteers and 40,000 horsemen of the Syrians, and struck Shobach, the commander of their army, who died there. And when the kings, who were servants of Hadadezer, saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and served them, and so the Syrians were afraid to help the people of Ammon anymore. So it took this, unfortunately, for all of these nations to realize they could have had peace. There was no reason to do what they did. David was doing a very peaceful thing and saying to the son of the king of Ammon, I'm sending comfort to you because your fathers died and he had shown kindness to me. All of David's motivations were good, but this just shows what happens. A person like David has the right heart, but he's not going to play the fool. So interesting how chapter 8 shows that David had defeated all of these people, with the exception of Ammon, because he was at peace with Ammon. But all of the same ones that had already been defeated in chapter 8 try to regather in chapter 10, adding the Ammonites, and they all get taken down, and they're really, really decimated by this time. So it really kind of can lead to a great deal of confidence, and maybe too much of it, so that you're not being mindful of what you should be when it comes to David kind of letting his guard down, I think you could say, in chapter 11. So we'll get there next week. It's intriguing. It's its own separate part of this historical account, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to just try to move into chapter 12, or I'm sorry, to chapter 11. We'll want to take our time with it because, gosh, it's a part of David, it's a side of David that we've never seen. And so I want to leave this where it is, and we'll pick up there next week. We'll pick up with that. Again, it's Bathsheba, so we know the whole story, I'm sure most of us, and but we'll look at it a little bit more detailed than just the kind of children's ministry view of it, that David and Bathsheba and all that stuff. So we'll get to it next week. We'll pick up there. If there are any questions about what we've covered today, then by all means you can contact us through email. It's found through our website, which is oldpaththeology.net. And if you're watching this on YouTube and you haven't had a chance to subscribe to the channel, do so. And it helps you to know when we're putting up content. We've had our hands full here, just so you know. I've got a lot of content that I'm very much looking forward to putting up. But I'm going to be a grandfather soon. Maybe some of you know I'm recording this at the beginning of March in 2021. We had a crazy cold spell here, and my daughter and her husband, pipes burst at their house, and so we've been over there doing all kinds of things, doing a bunch of things away from the ministry, so it's kind of slowed down some of the other content. But I will be getting some added in very soon. There's a lot going on, and want to be able to keep everybody up to speed. So with all that said, I pray that this has been helpful as we look through this. Again, it's a history. There's not a lot of what we would consider theology in it, other than that God was really with David and really showed him favor, and the subduing of the land around him. That's pretty telling that David's on the right track. And yet, at that time, it's always good to remember, no matter how good things are, keep your eyes on God and don't allow yourself to be distracted by the things of earth, because it really ends very poorly for him in chapter 11. We'll get there next week. So until then, I pray God blesses you as you study his word. Read through it during the week. I pray that you do have time where you're at all times putting time aside to hear from him through his word. And we thank you for joining us.